Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Jennifer Limley, and I'm an energy analyst with Breaky Energy. I'm joined today by Matt Breaky, president of Breaky Energy, and we are going to be discussing some of the regulatory and legislative threats, as well as savings opportunities for commercial and industrial customers in the state of Ohio. So let me just go ahead and open up our slideshow here. So we're going to start out.
Sorry, Jennifer, sorry for interrupting. If anyone has any questions as we progress, please use the chat feature, and I will be trying to monitor that just to field questions and key them up myself or Jennifer. But there will be no audible giving of questions at least until perhaps the end of the presentation.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to start off by just discussing a little bit of the active energy legislation, and then go on to talking about, what legislations we're anticipating for energy going into more into 2021. Then talking about the future of the interruptible programs, as well as the utilities transmission pilot programs. And then a discussion of an alternative method to establishing capacity and transmission tags. So the last couple of weeks has been a really busy one in the General Assembly. We are now in the 134th General Assembly. This is the beginning of a 2-year session. To date, there have been 7 pieces of legislation introduced that concern energy. At least these are 7 that we're going to discuss briefly today. There have also been some bills introduced concerning charging stations, utility supply contracts, and wind farm setbacks, but we are not going to be discussing those this morning. Just want to let everybody know too, as a reminder, there will be an interactive roundtable discussion with legislative leaders on Thursday morning at 8:30. So if you are interested in more about Ohio energy policy, I'm sure that you will get a lot more information about that on a general level on Thursday morning. So first off, we're going to discuss Senate Bill 10. This bill seeks to repeal the legal basis for all revenue decoupling charges, including those authorized by amended substitute House Bill 6. And just as a little background for those of you who are not familiar with decoupling, what decoupling does is it separates a utility's revenue from the volume of kilowatt hours it delivers. So it basically ensures that the utility meets its revenue target regardless of how many kilowatt hours it sells. So under Senate Bill 10, any amounts that were collected through decoupling mechanisms would be refunded to customers. All of Ohio utilities, except for DP&L at this point, do have decoupling charges in place. Those for AEP, Duke, and DP&L's previous charge were actually implemented following the enactment of the energy efficiency and peak demand reduction mandates back in 2019. So just as a little update on that, First Energy, of course, it had its decoupling rider authorized through House Bill 6. First Energy has now agreed to terminate collection of that charge in exchange for state officials pausing some lawsuit proceedings to block provisions of House Bill 6 from taking effect. So that actually occurred on February the 9th. So as of February the 9th, First Energy is no longer collecting the decoupling charge. The Senate Bill 10 would also repeal a provision enacted by House Bill 166 that impacts how the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio administers the significantly excessive earnings test. We call the SEAT test. This basically has to do with the current law, which allows a company that has affiliated utilities to combine their data to calculate the return on equity for the seat test. So what this bill would do is basically prevent that. Each utility would have to separate their return on equity separately for the seat test. This is a table that was developed by the Ohio Legislative Service Commission, and it was part of its fiscal analysis of Senate Bill 10. And what this shows is the estimated collections by each of the state's utilities under the current decoupling mechanisms. Now, this was based on 2020 filings, so it really isn't indicative of 2021, but this at least shows you what the utilities expected to collect last year, and it was about $44.5 million. So if Senate bill is enacted, all of these decoupling mechanisms would be repealed. And in addition to that, any amounts that were collected by CEI, OE, and Toledo Edison between February 1st of last year through February 9th of this year would be promptly refunded to customers. And then any money collected from customers as a result of First Energy aggregating its operating companies to calculate the seat, the return on common equity for seat would then also be promptly refunded to customers. Next is Senate Bill 29. This bill would prevent the automatic enrollment of customers in governmental or non-voluntary electric and natural gas aggregation programs. These aggregation programs are limited to what we call non-mercantile customers, so those customers that use under 700,000 kilowatt hours a year. And it also doesn't impact customers that are under contract with a retail electric supplier. However, what we have seen with some of our clients is that oftentimes they have smaller accounts that they really don't pay as much attention to, and sometimes those can be affected by these aggregation programs. They'll be automatically enrolled in the program, and oftentimes the customer isn't even aware that it has occurred. Because when these aggregation programs become effective, what they'll do is they send out a postcard or a letter just saying, hey, you know, we are going to be forming this aggregation for the purchase of either electric or natural gas, and you're going to be included in that unless you opt out. So it actually requires the customer to, pay attention, obviously, to those notices that, come across their desk, and also take action to opt out. So this would prohibit that, and instead it would turn these aggregation programs into more of a voluntary or opt-in programs. Senate Bill 44. Now this is the bill that Joe Price was speaking of a little bit earlier today. This is the one that would repeal the nuclear resource credit payment provisions and the related customer charges provided for in House Bill 6. So this would save customers $150 million a year. The bill would also amend the renewable resource credit payment by simply renaming it as the solar resource credit. Senate Bill 44 would retain the $20 million per year revenue requirement, but then would permit the payment only to the solar resources. Under the bill, the PUCO would be given the authority to determine the revenue allocation for each utility, subject to some rate caps. And that cap for residential customers would be 10 cents a month. And then the caps for customers that self-assess the kilowatt hour tax, and those are customers that use over 45 million kilowatt hours per year. For those customers, it would be capped at $242 per month. Then the PUCO would then have to establish rates for the other customer classes in a manner that avoids abrupt or excessive total net electric bill impacts. House Bill 10, this one was very recently introduced. This bill would establish a program for customer-sited energy waste reduction projects, which is basically just another way of saying energy efficiency projects. This bill would be administered not by the utilities, but by retail suppliers. However, the utilities would recover costs from customers as part of the monthly distribution bill. Then they would simply remit that money back to the suppliers to cover their cost of administering the program. All residential customers and non-residential customers that use less than 700,000 kilowatts a year would be subject to the charge unless they opt out. So basically they're mandated to pay that charge unless they take some active step to opt out of it. A mercantile customer, those that use above 700,000 kilowatt hours per year or are part of a national account that involves multiple facilities in one or more states, those customers may elect to enroll in the program. And by doing so, these customers can avoid paying the utilities transmission charge. And instead, they would be able to source transmission directly from PJM based on how the customer used power during the single highest grid peak of the year. Although the general feeling is that this bill isn't likely to get much traction in the General Assembly, it may provide a platform for discussing the need to provide customers with this kind of access to PJM billing for transmission. And so, you know, this kind of program that allows this access, you know, may come up in additional legislation as we go through the year. House Bill 18 and House Bill 57, again, these just very recently introduced. Both of these bills simply would repeal all provisions of House Bill 6 and it would revive prior law. These bills are actually identical, and they are identical to legislation that was introduced last session by the same representatives. And then House Bill 58. This bill is basically exactly the same as the seat provisions that are provided for in Senate Bill 10. So the exact same language, even as in Senate Bill 10. So going into 2021, you know, we knew that repealing or replacing House Bill 6 was really going to be a priority. And of course, you know, just in the last couple of weeks, we have seen, you know, several bills introduced that would, you know, do that, replace or repeal all or part of the legislation. And so I want to give just a little background about what House Bill 6 did and, you know, what would happen then if any of these provisions were repealed or replaced. So House Bill 6 was passed by the General Assembly and signed into law by the governor on July 23rd, 2019. And just as a point, it was the Senate's amended version of the bill that was enacted. The effective date of the bill was October 22nd of 2019, but different provisions became effective at different times after that date. Some of the key provisions of House Bill 6, well, it created Ohio's Clean Air Program, and that was to provide $170 million a year in out-of-market support to the state's nuclear and select solar resources. It also implemented a statewide mechanism for the recovery of costs related to the state's legacy coal generation resources. It reduced the state's renewable portfolio standards, RPS, and it also terminated the state's energy efficiency and peak demand reduction, or EEPDR, mandates. In addition, it authorized decoupling charges to allow FirstEnergy to separate their kilowatt-hour sales from revenues. As I mentioned earlier, FirstEnergy recently filed an application with the PUCO to end collection of its decoupling revenues that were permitted by House Bill 6, and so those charges did terminate February 9th of this year. That decoupling mechanism, which FirstEnergy refers to as its conservation support rider, would have cost customers approximately $102 million in 2021. There were also other provisions that were related to low-income weatherization, rate schedules for county fairs, small wind farms, net metering, and property tax exemptions for energy projects, but those really had limited impact on commercial industrial customers, so we're not really going to go to any more detail about those. So House Bill 6 levied some new charges on customers, and it also provided some savings opportunities for customers. One of the new charges was the Legacy Generation Rider, and this funds guaranteed cost recovery for Ohio's utility interest in 2 coal plants owned and operated by the Ohio Valley Electric Corporation, sometimes also referred to just as OVEC. Those charges began in January of last year, and they are set to continue through December the 31st of 2030. The LGR costs are capped at $1.50 a month for residential customers and $1,500 a month for non-residential customers. The LGR replaces utility-specific recovery mechanisms for AEP, DP&L, and Duke. The prior mechanisms had been approved by the PUCO to run through 2024, but they did not include any cost caps, and they did result in higher customer charges. House Bill 6 also authorized the Clean Air Fund rider charge. This was intended to fund out-of-market payments to Ohio's nuclear and select solar generation facilities. But for litigation, which we are going to discuss momentarily, these charges would have begun January of this year, and they would have continued through December the 31st of 2027. As we mentioned earlier, the Conservation Support Rider related to decoupling was also approved for House Bill 6. This was only applicable to residential and general service secondary customers that were served by FirstEnergy's operating companies. Talk a little more of that. In addition, there were some savings opportunities that were available to customers due to the passage of House Bill 6. One of those was the revision of the state's renewable portfolio standards, and then the termination of the standards after 2026. The bill also granted customers that self-assess the state kilowatt hour tax exemption from RPS related charges. House Bill 6 expanded the EEPDR streamlined opt-out mechanism to include all mercantile customers effective January 1st of 2020. So prior to this date, only customers served at or above subtransmission voltage were eligible to opt out of the EEPDR. House Bill 6 also repealed the opt-out reporting requirements that were mandated by former law. House Bill 6 reduced the state's EEPDR benchmarks and terminated the state's mandates effective December 31st of 2020. So basically it replaced these yearly savings benchmarks for each utility with a statewide cumulative benchmark of 17.5% by the end of 2020. Sorry, EDUs were found to be in full compliance with the EEPDR benchmarks, and so the PUCO ordered the utilities to terminate the collection of those charges effective December the 31st. In a May 2020 document, the Legislative Service Commission estimated that House Bill 6 provides net savings to Ohio ratepayers of more than $2.3 billion compared to prior law. That was within a 10-year period. Keep in mind that this does not include the $102 million in savings from FirstEnergy's agreement to end collecting the decoupling revenues for 2021. It doesn't include the fact that the EEPDR costs were set to double beginning this year, and it doesn't include the potential savings that has resulted from the injunction and possible termination of the Clean Air Fund charges. So the savings of the $2.3 billion, those were simply the result of reforms related to the EEPDR mandates and the renewable portfolio standards, and then of course those cost caps on the OVEC related charges. So this is simply a summary of the legislation that was introduced in the prior session. We had some that were calling for just a full repeal of the bill, one that would have only repealed provisions related to the Clean Air program, and one that would have just delayed the implementation of the Clean Air Fund charges and then provided some additional authority to the Ohio Air Quality Development Authority to cease or reduce payments if resources didn't meet certain criteria. And of course, since none of those were passed, then they actually all terminated. And since then, the General Assembly would have to reintroduce legislation to do anything about House Bill 6. Several members of the General Assembly, of course, have indicated that repealing or replacing House Bill 6 is a priority for the new session. And of course, we have seen several bills introduced just recently. House Bill 18 and House Bill 57 calling for the full repeal. Those have been introduced, and there will be sponsor testimony tomorrow in the Public Utilities Committee at 11 o'clock. We have two pieces of legislation calling for the partial repeal or revision of House Bill 6. That's Senate Bill 10, which would repeal only the provisions relating to decoupling. This bill has had 3 committee hearings to date. It's had sponsor, proponent, and interested party testimony. Then there's Senate Bill 44, which would repeal the provisions related to the nuclear resource credit, and then it would amend the renewable resource credits just to be solar. And that bill has proponent testimony today, actually probably going on still right now in the Senate committee. So before we get on to this next slide, I did want to point out that, when you're considering the legislation that has been introduced, please keep in mind that these were introduced by legislators that didn't support House Bill 6 to begin with. And also keep in mind that, many of the people, well, actually all of the people who voted for House Bill 6 were reelected, and some of the people that voted against it were not reelected. And of course, then, we have some new legislators, so and it's hard to determine what their feelings are on House Bill 6. So, whether these pieces of legislation are more likely to pass now than they were last year, it might be unlikely, but I doubt this will be the last of the legislations that are introduced that attempt to address concerns relating House Bill 6. In the meantime, though, we have been provided some relief by the courts. The Ohio Attorney General and the cities of Columbus and Cincinnati filed lawsuits against First Energy. And then on December the 21st, the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas granted a request for a preliminary injunction to block the collection of the Clean Air Fund charges from customers beginning on January the 1st, 2021. So that's the day that the charges should have begun. So instead, this injunction prevented the collection of those charges, and they have not shown up on customer bills. This injunction is temporary, but it will likely remain in place throughout the court case. So again, just to let you know that the court case has been put on hold in exchange for First Energy agreeing not to charge those $102 million decoupling revenues. So, at this point, at least, it looks like the General Assembly is going to need to take action to do something to either permanently repeal or replace provisions of House Bill 6, if that indeed is their priority. So repealing and replacing House Bill 6 brings with it some threats to savings for customers and as well as opportunities for maybe some additional savings. Full repeal of House Bill 6 would eliminate the cost saving provisions of the legislation along with the Clean Air Fund provision. So we consider this the throw in the baby out with the bathwater option. Any legislation that delays implementation may not go far enough to address the customer's concerns with the program. And so a partial repeal or replacement would permit legislators to address the Clean Air Fund program without sacrificing the savings opportunities presented and the other provisions of House Bill 6. And this is the path that we feel is most likely to result in a more positive outcome for customers. So obviously, there's a lot still that's unknown about what's going to happen with House Bill 6, but this at least is, where we are right now. So we'll definitely be keeping an eye on that. Next, we're going to talk about the future of interruptible programs. A little background about what interruptible programs are. These are programs to provide bill credits in exchange for customers' interruptible or curtailable power. Interruptible power helps to maintain balance on the electric grid. Participants in these programs agree to drop their non-firm load during times when the grid is under stress and at risk of brown or blackouts, and this helps to keep the lights on. Interruptible programs are particularly beneficial to customers with load flexibility who are subject to very high monthly demand charges. So these interruptible credits offset some of those high demand charges. In Ohio, 2 of our utilities have current interruptible programs. It's First Energy and AEP. First Energy's program is called the Economic Load Response, or ELR program. Participants in this program receive credits equal to $10 per kilowatt of curtailable load per month. This program is authorized through First Energy's current electric security plan, which ends at the end of May 2024. AEP's program is called the Interruptible Power Discretionary Legacy, or IRPD Legacy, or Legacy Customer Program. Participants in this program receive credits equal to $9 per kilowatt of interruptible power per month, and this program is authorized through AEP's current electric security plan, which ends with the June 2024 billing cycle. The credits that participants received are funded by firm customers, so other customers. So unless authorized in future ESPs, interruptible programs may end at the end of May or beginning of June of 2024. Loss of interruptible programs will create electric rate shock for participants. The PUCO staff has previously recommended phasing out the interruptible programs. And just a reminder, these participants are energy intensive manufacturers, and they're subject to international competition. So, if these programs are phased out, then there needs to be some sort of continued mechanism to help these customers remain competitive.
Yeah, Jennifer, I'll jump in really quick.
Sure.
I would say that, Jennifer, could you actually, while I'm speaking, I'm hearing some feedback that I suspect I'll participate. Thank you. I would just say that not since perhaps 2008, 2009, when Ohio ratepayers were looking at the possibility of rate shock, I don't think we've seen as big of a cliff that some users are facing as it is with the phase out of these interruptible programs. I can't emphasize enough that if these programs are allowed to simply go away with no suitable replacement, the consequences to these large energy intensive users, I think, will be catastrophic from an electric bill perspective, and will result in the closure of many large facilities in Ohio. So I can't emphasize enough, to the extent we have anyone from the commission listening to this workshop, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to find a good path forward after the slated expiration of these programs. Back to you, Jennifer.
I apologize for that. My screen disappeared. I'll go back here. So now we're going to discuss the future of the utilities transmission pilot programs. As a review, transmission service is a service for moving electricity across the high voltage lines, and it's included as a charge in your monthly electric bill. This service is regulated exclusively by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. PJM Interconnect, or PJM, oversees the operation of the transmission systems in much of the eastern United States, including Ohio. It is the transmission service provider. PJM bills load-serving entities such as EDUs and retail suppliers for transmission, and then remits the revenue to transmission owners. And then the load-serving entities pass that transmission cost on to customers. One thing I did want to point out is that transmission costs are formula rate based, which makes them like a big rider. So transmission revenue requirements can be updated each year. They don't require any kind of rate case, and they can be based on projected cost of any planned projects, and really in a way that has very little regulatory oversight. And we're going to talk a little bit in a couple more slides about what impact that has had on costs for customers. So the utilities then pass on the cost of transmission to customers as a surcharge on the monthly electric bills. The method in which the utilities pass on the cost to customers is often different than how PJM actually bills the utility. So the method that the utilities use is most often just monthly demand based, and in turn this reduces the value of demand response for customers. So I'm not going to go into depth, but these are the recovery mechanisms that the four Ohio investor and utilities use to recover transmission costs. You'll notice that some of the utilities do include a kilowatt hour charge or even a reactive demand charge, but it is primarily this monthly billed demand component which drives the transmission costs for customers. FirstEnergy, AEP, and DP&L currently have pilot programs in place which permit eligible customers to pay for transmission based primarily on how they use power during specific 1-hour intervals of the year when demand on their zonal grids peak. These 1-hour intervals are referred to as CPs, or coincident peaks. FirstEnergy uses the customer's load during 5 CPs, so the 5 1-hour intervals of the year when load on its zonal grid peaks, to determine the customer's transmission tag for the following year. AEP and DP&L use the customer's load during the single highest peak of the year to determine the customer's transmission tag. These transmission tags are used to calculate transmission cost, and then instead of the monthly bill demand for customers that participate in the pilot programs. Customers that operate off-peak or that are not weather sensitive may have transmission tags that are significantly lower than their monthly bill demands. Also, customers that can curtail demand in response to potential zonal grid peaks can lower their transmission tags. So there's a potential for these types of customers to save significantly on their transmission costs. The current transmission pilot programs end when the ESPs that authorize them end. Again, for FirstEnergy, that's going to be the end of May 2024. For AEP, it will be during the June 2024 billing period. DP&L's ESP termination date is a little bit up in the air. It was originally slated to expire on December the 31st of 2023, but there was a settlement in that ESP case, or ESP3 case, which extended the termination date to the end of 2024. DP&L has since withdrawn their ESP3 and reverted back to ESP1. In doing so, they did retain the pilot, but it's still a little unclear of when everything in that ESP will actually terminate. And again, loss of these transmission pilot programs will create electric rate shock for participants. And if you consider that, you know, many of the interruptible customers also participate in these transmission pilot programs, you know, the termination of both of those things at the end of the ESPs, we obviously will just, you know, cause a significant increase in cost and, like Matt said, have dire ramifications.
You're looking at rate increases on an order of magnitude for customers seeing their bills double, triple, quadruple. I mean, even saying quintuple, I don't think is an exaggeration for some customers if they lose both of these programs at the exact same time.
So now we're going to discuss, a possible alternative method to establishing capacity and transmission tags. Something that may address concerns about potential transmission pilot programs and even concerns with the interruptible programs. So we talked already about transmission, went over that. Capacity is a subcomponent of electric generation. So typically when we talk about electric service, we talk about three components. There's distribution, there's transmission, and then there's capacity. There's generation, and capacity is just one of those components of the generation. Customers pay capacity charges to ensure that there is sufficient power available on the grid to meet peak demands at any time. Customer's capacity obligation is determined by how much power that customer uses during the 5 hours of the summer when PJM's regional grid peaks. So we usually call that the 5 capacity CPs. So their load during those 5 hours scaled up for weather normalization and losses can be referred to as their capacity tag, or sometimes also referred to their peak load contribution. Capacity prices are determined by a series of PJM auctions, and the prices can fluctuate for each delivery year. For example, last year the prices were $98 per megawatt day. This year they're around $77 per megawatt day. And then on June 1st, when the next delivery year begins, the prices are going to go up to about $158 per megawatt day. So they fluctuate, but they're always based on the outcomes of those auctions, and prices can vary just based on how much resource auction is in the auction, if there's any kind of congestion on the system, things like that. However, transmission rates are formula-based, which I discussed a little bit earlier, and those have increased year over year. So this slide, we are showing the annual transmission revenue requirements for the 4 investor-owned utilities in the state of Ohio from 2015 through 2021. In that time period, AEP's revenue requirements have gone up 98%, so nearly doubled in 6 years. ATSI, which is First Energy's transmission subsidiary, has increased 82% over the last 6 years. DP&L's requirement has increased 58%, and Duke's has increased 83% in the last 6 years. We anticipate that these trends are going to continue as utilities increase transmission investments as a way to grow their earnings. Unfortunately, there's very little regulatory oversight to discourage this, and customers typically have no idea this is happening until they see the increase on their monthly bills. Customers that actively manage capacity and transmission tags must take steps to reduce their load in advance of potential grid peaks. So this may require the customer to drop load for up to 6 hours a day, 10 to 15 times a year. Curtailments are often problematic in that they interrupt customer operations and they result in lost productivity. What's really frustrating is that these occur when there are no physical limitations on the electric grid. So what basically this is doing, it's incentivizing customers to operate in a way that underutilizes their capital assets. So the PUCO is aware of this issue, and they have expressed interest in finding a solution to this chasing the peaks problem. There's particular interest in a solution that could also address concerns surrounding the continuation of the interruptible programs. So I believe it was the end of 2019, early 2020, PUCO held a workshop and invited customer groups to present possible solutions to this problem. In December 2019, the Industrial Energy Users of Ohio submitted a proposal to the PUCO that they refer to as the Purchasing Firm Demand option. This option would permit a customer to set its own capacity and transmission tags based on a specified firm service level. So participating customers will be required to curtail to their firm levels only in event of some kind of physical limitation on the grid. So no more of that, dropping load for 6 hours a day, 10 to 15 times a year to try to get the peaks. Of course, then customers that fail to curtail to firm service during those times would be subject to disconnection or penalties. This option could be expanded also to permit a customer to set its own monthly billing demand based on firm service. So there's other, applications of this concept. IEU has recommended that the purchasing firm demand option be used to expand the options that are available to customers. They have also recommended that this option be offered as a voluntary alternative to chasing the peaks method. So there are some customers, especially those that operate off peak, that may actually be able to have a transmission tag that is significantly low to drive savings by just using the current method. So in that case, they didn't want to choose this other alternative. The PUCO, they also recommend that the PUCO retain other programs such as the transmission pilot and demand response programs. One last note that I would like to point out that although the transmission pilots, especially used in combination with something like the firm demand option, can significantly reduce cost for customers. Unfortunately, until something is done to rein in the utility spending on transmission projects, even these customers are going to continue to see their transmission cost climb. So, where transmission pilots, of course, are wonderful options for customers, we still need to be looking, I think, at the bigger picture, and that, there just seems to be this unending increase in transmission projects that are just driving cost increase for customers. So that's really all I had. Matt, I don't know if you wanted to add or if there were any questions that we should address.
Nothing additional from me. Any questions? And I'm not sure how we can unmute everyone, so I would suggest if you have a question, do it so through the chat. Normally I would say, okay, let's just break, but I know there potentially could be someone pecking away, so give it another 20 seconds or so. There we go. So Katie asked, can you explain the caps and customer slot limits associated with the BTCR pilot? Jennifer, take it away.
Sure. So what Katie is referring to is the transmission pilot program for AEP. So AEP, in fact, all of the utilities, they have some limitations on who can participate in these transmission pilot programs. And for AEP, there were allotted just a certain number of slots for customer groups. And so that limited the number of customers that could participate in AEP's pilot. But then the ESP also specified the amount of monthly kilowatts that could subscribe to the program subject to a cap, so a financial cap. So basically what that says is, the cap is 500 megawatts per month, so eligible customers can participate, but AEP only has to provide the financial benefit for that 500 megawatts, and if there's any demand above that level, then they don't receive the benefit for that additional amount. So That has actually become an issue very recently. We just learned that AEP has stated that they think that there will be about 750 megawatts participating in the pilot beginning April 1st of this year. So that's 250 megawatts above the cap. And so what that has created is, transmission pilot savings that are greatly reduced, probably, around half of what we originally thought that they, would be receiving. So that has greatly reduced those transmission savings.
Jennifer, you want to field Andrew's question, which is, you talked about the order of magnitude jump for future transmission costs. Would that just be for companies in the pilots? You spoke to the anticipated rise in general due to the lack of regulation, but I just want to clarify if there were singular events that could cause jumps for typical monthly billed customers.
Well, so the jump in transmission cost is applicable to every customer. So what happens is, the difference is that a customer participating in the pilot pays transmission costs based on their transmission tag, but a customer that doesn't, participate in the pilot is still paying for transmission, and they're paying for transmission through a rider on their utility bill every month. So what we have seen is, the increases are affecting every customer, but those that are not participating in the pilot program are actually seeing much more significant increases just because of how the utilities pass on those costs of transmission onto customers. And then let me see the second part of this question. So I'm not sure if this answers your question. You're actually asking if there are any singular events that could cause jumps for typical monthly billed customers. So something that we have noticed in the last few years has been this move to these formula rates, which we talked a little bit about earlier. I don't understand necessarily the math of how that happens, but what happens at any time that they move to these formula rates is there's typically a jump in the transmission cost in the year that they've made the transmission. So we did see that in DP&L. If you notice the graph for DP&L, we had a large increase this year, and that's because DP&L just recently moved to these formula rates. I can't speak to any other singular events. Matt, do you have any?
No, it's more, rather than a singular event, it's the ongoing trend of a lot of iron being put into the ground, and has been resulting in transmission costs exploding across all of Ohio's investor-owned utilities. And so what seems, based on other presentations that will be given in this conference, it seems like this is going to be a theme that we will see throughout the discussion of this issue and the bill implications for customers. Katie asks, are there any specific efforts or conversations about ending the caps and slots associated with the BTCR pilot and making the program permanent? Do you think those conversations would be able to get traction? Well, I know we are having those conversations with a few clients who recently learned of AEP's rate error in front of the commission. Jennifer, you want to handle that?
Right. So I discussed a little bit earlier about the financial benefit cap, the 500 megawatt financial benefit cap. And Matt just alluded to there being an error. So earlier this year, AEP filed their rates, both for their regular customers and then also for the customers participating in their pilot. And they were increased rates for pilot customers, but they were, fairly reasonable. And then we just recently find out just in the last few days that AEP had made an error in the calculation. Apparently, they didn't take into account the extra step, 250 megawatts enrolled in the pilot, and so rates went from I'm just taking one customer class, for example, $8.58 per kilowatt to $22.95 per kilowatt. So a huge increase. And so we've seen customers transmission costs in the pilot going up about 150% on April the 1st. So obviously, you know, we see a big issue with this cap, and we also you know, have some issue with the fact that there's only a limited number of slots available, and so, you know, participating in the pilot is very limited to specific eligible customers. Continuation, expansion of the pilot program for AEP is certainly conversations that we've been having. There is currently a base distribution rate case at the PUCO, which we, through our involvement in the Industrial Energy Users of Ohio, have been involved. One of the things that we're advocating for, obviously, is a termination of the financial benefit cap, or some sort of revision to that, upwards, of course, so that we wouldn't see these huge rate impacts anytime there's an over subscription on a megawatt base into the pilots. And like we were discussing earlier with, I'm trying to think of the House bill out of my head, but one of the pieces of legislation that's introducing this concept of opening up this transmission, PJM-based transmission billing for any mercantile customer that, you know, the bill, obviously you have to participate in these energy efficiency programs, but, you know, just the concept that, you know, this needs to be available to any of the mercantile customers. So really this conversation is really being addressed on several fronts, not just with AEP, but also, you know, we'll be doing the same when we start conversations about First Energy's ESP. There's conversations being had in some of DP&L's rate cases at the PUCO. So obviously this is something we're advocating for strongly, you know, this idea of continuing and expanding these transmission pilot programs. Matt, did you have anything to add?
Maybe I'll just add that one thing to keep in mind, these pilot programs essentially is just getting access to a flavor of PJM's default tariff. It's actually Ohio that has the auditing and how customers are paying for transmission, which mostly are some variation on a monthly peak demand basis. So all these pilots essentially do is give customers billing access to PJM's tariff, and we think it's the more equitable of the two formulas to use. Any other questions before we break? It's you know, normally in a workshop, people have to deal with the little like shame of like packing your stuff up and like sneaking out the back door, and people don't have to do that in the virtual world. But you know, we appreciate everyone joining, and feel free to reach out to myself or Jennifer if any additional questions come up, or if anyone is listening to this on a recorded basis after the fact and did not participate in person, please do not hesitate to reach out with any questions. All right, thank you everyone. We will conclude.
Thank you.